So the way we came about thinking about this roundtable is to think about ways in which law is deployed in the governance of sexual subjects as part of a kind of Foucauldian biopolitics. Now, I say this in that we are Foucault-inspired, but not Foucault-reconciled, because of the ongoing focus on law that we have, albeit in a kind of dispersed, diffuse, multiple, plural, constitutive, Foucault-inspired fashion. And by technology, so we've kind of struggled around thinking how one thinks about technology, moving out of the actual material scientific notion around technologies to, on the one hand, a kind of notion perhaps of techniques, which is what Ellul talked about in the 1960s, or really a little bit more probably like technologies of power from Foucault, the idea of biopower as a particular technology of governing of indocile bodies and populations. And what I think, what we're trying to look at here is what does the specificity of each of our work tell us more generally about technologies of sexual governance. Each of us focus on the legal regulation of sexuality. Sexuality, which again, as Foucault tells us, is a strategic terrain of biopower because it brings together these two fundamental elements of disciplining the body and disciplining populations. We focus on sex law, which I guess we would broadly define as, maybe narrowly define, I'm not sure if it's broad or narrow, a set of rules and principles for decision making that are carried out through a series of bureaucratic apparatuses, courts, tribunals, local decision making, what Jeannie Suk might call the sex bureaucracy, that focuses specifically on the regulation of sex and sexuality. It's not a particularly well established discipline of law. It's not like administrative law or family law, although we would make a claim that it is its own discipline of regulation. Our projects look at the multiple ways that sex laws have operated to facilitate, undermine, preempt, constitute sexual justice, sexual citizenship, belonging of sexual subjects, or perhaps said the opposite way, conversely, the ways in which sex has operated, or sex law has operated to govern indocile bodies and populations, and exploring the terrain and conditions of belonging. So, as I say, now each of our speakers are going to speak briefly about their projects, and then we'll move to a conversation with each other, and then we'll move to a conversation with all of you folks. So, over to Luke.
So, despite what my research focuses on being the 19th century family law issues, I'm actually going to talk about buggery law today in 19th century New South Wales. My remarks today arise out of research that I've conducted recently into what I believe is all, or very nearly all, available records of buggery cases in the first 50 years of colonisation in New South Wales, commencing in 1788. Today is actually Australia Day in Australia, for those who are aware. So the remarks last night, or the talk last night, was very apposite for me. In a nutshell, this research reveals that in the first 40 years of colonisation, up to the passage of the Offences Against the Person Act of 1828, there was an unpredictable pattern of sodomy charges in New South Wales. So I'm not considering bestiality cases today, even though they fell within the ambit of the buggery law. In the next 10 years, however, the number of men who were brought before the courts on sodomy charges rose dramatically, but also stabilised on an annual basis at rates significantly in excess of that seen in England, at least when population is taken into account. The data reveal certain other trends, notably a post-1828 shift towards charging the capital offence, and a move away from exemplary forms of punishment, but I won't deal with those points today for reasons of time. Before delving into the cases, though, I just want to explain my own take on this topic of sexuality and governance and technology. The technological element for me comes into play here at a methodological level. This research would have been difficult to the point of impossibility without the use of digital archives. Thankfully, there's a Sydney historian named Peter Duval who's put together the most extraordinary repository of online records of these cases. It's called Unfit for Publication. And it's a compendium of literally thousands of records culled from local newspapers all around the state. Hundreds of newspapers, thousands of records. Along with depositions, judges' notes, bench books and the like. And it's just searchable by year. But extraordinarily, nobody seems to have actually mined this data for any of the insights that it reveals. So this is just a sort of a step in the direction of that. The second connection is speaks to what Brenda was talking about, this idea of law as a technology of governance. And I suppose my take on this is slightly sort of temporally back in time if we're talking about Foucault. I'm looking at this as a slightly more juridical technology. Buggery law is a technology of coercion and punishment, albeit operating in tandem with social power. The juridical is not an entirely positivist conception of law, an Austinian command-based system, but is a large part of it. The juridical also involves a network of power relations, social mandates to discourage people from committing certain acts. So much of what I'm going to talk about fits within this conception of law, but obviously we can see some of it sort of leaching over into the biopolitical. For reasons of time, I'm not going to explain the relationship between New South Wales law in the early colonial period and English law. Suffice it to say that the 1533 statute passed under Henry VIII concerning buggery translated into or became part of New South Wales law upon the arrival of the First Fleet. I can talk to anybody about that if they're interested. But it applied until 1828 when the English Offences Against the Person Act also came into force through some unique statutes that applied in New South Wales at that time. The main point to note about the 1828 Act is what it did to the change, or what it did to evidence law at that point. It changed the previous situation and removed the need to prove admission. So as the Act put it, carnal knowledge shall be deemed completed upon proof of penetration only, a significant evidentiary change. So, my analysis of the cases reveals that in the 40-year period between the arrival of the First Fleet in 1788 and the introduction of the Offences Act in 1828, there were 14 cases brought against men for sodomy and assault with intent to commit sodomy. The charges were split 3 to 11 in that ratio. The only convictions for sodomy occurred in 1808 and involved 2 men, Richard Moxworthy and John Hopkins, for actions committed on board a ship. Both men were sentenced to death but were pardoned on condition of serving as convicts for life. Now, in raw terms, 14 charges over a 40-year period is a low figure, but this picture changes somewhat when the size of the population is taken into account. For instance, in 1808, the year that Moxworthy and Hopkins were convicted, the population in New South Wales, at least according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, was only 9,100 people. As an annual average per 100,000 people then, this gives a rate of 22 charges per 100,000 people. Now, to put this in comparative context, research into sodomy charges against men in the same period in England has shown that the rate throughout the 19th century never rose above 1 charge per 100,000 people. Now, there were obviously many years in this period where there were no charges against men, so to compensate for this somewhat, I've also calculated the average annual rate for the entire 40-year period. This still gives a comparatively high rate of 3.2 sodomy charges per 100,000 people. The decade, however, following the introduction of the Offences Act in 1828 saw a dramatic increase in the number of charges laid against men in New South Wales for sodomy. 26 charges were laid against men, with a further 8 charges of assault with intent to commit. So, between 1828 and 1838, there were 34 cases against men for sodomy and attempts, compared with just 14 such charges in the preceding 40-year period. Even when increasing population size is taken into account, the average annual rate nearly doubled, from 3.2 charges in the first 40 years to 5.9 charges in the following decade. The English figures for that particular decade reveal a rate hovering between 0.4 and 0.9 charges. So to put this in comparison again, to the extent that we can compare these two societies at this time, the New South Wales rate was between 6 and 15 times higher than the rate in England. Now, given that New South Wales was a penal colony, it's not especially surprising to find in the cases, the majority of these cases were brought against convicts. What I think is more surprising, though, is the way in which the cases actually came to court. It was primarily, and I think this is particularly important from the perspective of explaining why there was this jump, they were primarily brought as a result of community surveillance. So despite the fact that there were a series of magistrates and constables, there was no police force in the sense that we think of nowadays, but there were magistrates and constables there to oversee the convicts. Nevertheless, it was primarily passers-by, masters, publicans and victims of sexual assault who were bringing these charges. So on the face of it, the explanation for this upswing post-1828 would appear relatively simple. It's got to be the Offences Against the Person Act. But I think this is only part of the explanation. Given the community-based nature of the complaints, connecting a rise in the number of charges to the introduction of the Act would seem to me to require some kind of evidence that ordinary people were not only aware of the changes in the Act, but that these changes also affected their attitudes and behaviour. Now, this is an almost impossible task of historical reconstruction. The evidence that is available, however, indicates that while the new Act received some public coverage, it was hardly at the forefront of the cultural mind. It therefore seems more plausible that the post-1828 rise in charges was the product of both law and broader social patterns interacting. In particular, I suggested an increasing climate of moralism in New South Wales in the 1820s and particularly in the 1830s, combined with legal changes to create an incitement to speak. Far from a censorship of sex, there was an apparatus for producing an ever greater quantity of discourse about sex. To give but one example, the publication in 1823 of Commissioner Biggs' report into the state of the colony of New South Wales generated considerable moral anxiety in the colony. Biggs suggested the existence of a causal linkage between disorderly and immoral behaviour in New South Wales and the imbalance in the sex ratio. Both the report and the immigration scheme formed the subject of extensive local coverage in local newspapers, part of what the historian Frank Bongiorno has described as the sensational exposure of social evil to parliamentary and public view. In this way, official concern over moral laxity was transmitted to the general population via the release of official reports and newspaper coverage of official measures. The result was an exacerbation of long-standing colonial anxieties over the sex ratio and unnatural sex practices. By the 1830s, sodomy was coming to stand for the unnaturalness of convict transportation as a system of punishment, and panic over its prevalence was especially tied up with the threat it posed to the model of respectable family life that was finally beginning to penetrate the lower orders of New South Wales society. In this respect, localised surveillance of male sexuality, particularly convict male sexuality, formed part of a bourgeois imperial culture of manners, which stresses the importance of personal respectability and domestic morality. This concern with moral propriety sat alongside a more general public concern with contamination by criminals. In England, social reformers spoke of licentiousness capable of corrupting the whole body of society, like an insidious disease which eludes observation. In New South Wales, this fear translated into acute anxiety over convicts who were regarded as crime-prone by definition. The cases themselves provide evidence of this incitement to speak of sodomy's existence. Many witnesses in the cases surveyed herein gave evidence of having followed accused persons due to suspected criminal intent, to confirm their suspicions and, I suspect, to satisfy their own prurient interests. Those witnesses would often remain watching the action for many minutes before intervening or before calling for the assistance of officials. This tendency towards prurience had implications in court, where the incitement to speak was mandated by the nature of evidence law. Despite the mantra repeated in cases that buggery was a sin not to be named among Christians, and an unusual degree of reticence in popular reports of buggery cases, the euphemisms unnatural and nameless signifying buggery's horrors. The records of trials conducted between 1788 and 1838 reveal that witnesses were by no means circumspect in their evidence given to court. Far from being unspeakable, the evidentiary requirements for a sodomy conviction meant that the various acts were in many cases the subject of detailed public description. I'm not going to go into the details of what was actually said. If anyone's interested, I can point you to some fairly lurid examples. The point that I want to make, though, is that the buggery trial itself was an apparatus for producing an ever greater quantity of discourse about sex. The law and the press in colonial New South Wales whispered that buggery was an offence not to be named, but in the same instance it proclaimed the necessity for witnesses to loudly speak forth the truth of buggery's existence and the manner of its commission in order to secure the convictions of those who stood accused. In these ways, buggery laws in colonial New South Wales can be seen to have functioned as juridical technologies of sexual injustice. In turn, our knowledge of this history is furthered by the application of modern forms of digital technology, enabling the construction of statistical, and one might therefore even say biopolitical, analysis of buggery, community surveillance, and the incitement to speak. Thank you.
I am going to talk about something that's related but a little different to my dissertation today. I wrote a paper that is going to be coming out in the next Southern Poverty Law Center journal. I think it's called the Journal of Gender, Race, and Poverty. So anyways, if anything that I say interests you, you can look it up in a bit. I'm going to be talking about what I call the sexting paradox that we see in the United States. So I think the best way to explain what I mean by the sexting paradox is just to give you an example of a case. In 2005, there was this case in North Carolina, Fayetteville, North Carolina, when a 16-year-old heterosexual black couple were charged with sexually exploiting themselves. So what happened is they were charged under provisions enacted to combat child sexual abuse in the early 1980s. The teens were charged for possessing images of themselves and each other on their respective phones. While ostensibly about sexting, the images may never have been sent over text message at all. Police found the images during a search of students' phones of an unrelated allegation of assault. The policeman seized the two 16-year-olds' phones when he discovered sexually explicit images saved on them. The two teenagers were charged, this is the paradox, is they were charged as adults for sexually exploiting themselves as children. So as a result of being charged as adults, there's the possibility for being on the sex offender registry for life. And there's no publication ban on your name. So there's been a ton of media attention to these kids. They eventually pled to misdemeanors, served probation, avoided placement on the sex offender registry, but they had to attend courses on good decision making, abstained from drugs and alcohol, and were prohibited from owning phones for 3 years. So the case drew really sharp criticism from academics and from politicians. They called the charges dysfunctional, ludicrous, crazy, and an overreach. There were accusations in the media of overzealous prosecutorial misuse of child pornography laws intended to protect children. So I look at this problem a little bit differently. And I identify what I call the censorship story arc. So what I see when I look at obscenity laws is this story arc where the people that they're initially trying to protect end up being the ones that are subject to the laws in the first place. So what I started to do is look at child pornography laws as a separate branch of obscenity law that began in the early 1980s. So this was a case called Ferber that found that child pornography doesn't have any First Amendment protection. And then after that case, there's very little academic writing about it until the sexting paradox starts up. And then people are starting to talk a lot about it. So the censorship story arc is really similar to the first obscenity regime that started in like the 1870s. So about 30 years after, in the 1920s, we see obscenity laws that were initially being used to protect, or initially intended to protect women, are being used against sexually rebellious women themselves on stage. The first obscenity laws in the United States were passed in the heat of the white slave trade panic in the late 19th century. After World War II, social purity reformers revived these obscenity laws in an environment that could never have been anticipated when they were enacted. The Roaring Twenties created a backlash of social reformers determined to rid New York of vice and immorality. And in this environment, actress and playwright Mae West was arrested on obscenity charges for off-Broadway production of Sex and the Drag. These plays, Sex was the story of a prostitute, and The Drag was a play about a gay man. And it was actually the first time drag queens played themselves on stage. So what happened is the social purity reformers used the obscenity laws to eventually shut down these productions and arrest Mae West and 19 other performers. And they staged this big elaborate arrest at this, like right before the curtains were about to be drawn, and there was this big crowd, and she goes off, and the reporters asked what they thought about she thought about the charges, and she said, I think this is going to make me, is what she said. And it kind of did. Anyways, so turning to theory a little bit, in analyzing a particular problem, Foucault uses a unique method that involves scouring the annals of history for artifacts that might reveal something about our present. For example, in Discipline and Punish, Foucault sets out to provide a history of the modern system of punishment, but in the process, he ends up uncovering a history of the present, a history that continues to maintain control of the will and inclinations of human beings. So to describe what he means by the project of docility, he uses the image of a soldier. So Foucault argues that the human body became engulfed in coercive forces, increasing the body's productivity. Docile bodies were distinct from slavery, he argues, because it was not based on the sale of bodies. Foucault argues docile bodies became even more valuable than slaves because of the elegance of discipline. If a docile population can be trained to do the work of slaves, then there's no need for the costly and violent institution. So the soldier's body to Foucault, the project of docility, the soldier was groomed to get rid of the peasant and give him the air of the soldier. Through corporal discipline, young man's posture was gradually corrected, his habits slowly molded into that of a soldier, holding his head high and erect, standing upright, throwing out his chest. Foucault says the human body was entering a machinery of power that explores it, breaks it down, and rearranges it. The goal was to create a docile citizen, one that begins to discipline themselves. So what I think the connection between the Fayetteville Romeo and Juliet, which is what they call them because I don't want to use their names, and the trials of Mae West is these laws that are originally being used to protect either women or children are being used against what is socially considered indocile bodies, indocile sexual bodies. Mae West, because of the nature of her plays, but also because of her political positions. She once said that she'd only get married as a last resort. She was nicknamed the Queen of Sex. And more dangerous still, she produced plays that titillated audience with voyeur's delight into gay communities in red light districts. So the social purity reformers were really, really worried about this. They, like you alluded to, Luke, saw immorality as a poison, as sort of an airborne illness that was, if it wasn't contained, it was going to spread. And they used the trials of Mae West to send a strong message to young women in the 1920s in New York. The message they tried to send was, sluts will be shamed, basically. And similarly, the Fayetteville Romeo and Juliet, I think, can be seen as indocile bodies. I argue the Fayetteville teens represent the iconic figure of the masturbating child that's been the subject of acute social and legal anxiety, at least since the 17th century, according to Foucault. The visual representation of a naked masturbating teenager is exactly the type of behavior that's been considered dangerous from a moral, individual, and collective perspective. Unlike the metaphorical soldier, these teenagers have failed to conform to the norms of modesty and docility imposed on them. These naked bodies were dangerous not because they were corrupting the morals of others, as there's no evidence these images were even sent to each other. Instead, the images of naked bodies were dangerous because they represented bodies that could not be harnessed, conformed, and fixed. They were dangerous because they evidenced a masturbating teenager. Accordingly, they had to be punished and disciplined. The Fayetteville teens are a classic example of disciplinary examination and hypervisibility. They are charged as adults for exploiting themselves as children. As a result, their names weren't subject to the publication ban. The norms that the arrest sought to enforce were being simultaneously reinforced and destabilized by a proliferation of examination of these teenagers. It was also through this method of discipline that correct training was encouraged, because the only way for these teenagers to accept this, to escape this hypervisibility, was to conform and to stop what was considered inappropriate moral behavior. And so that is sort of how we see the Docility Project playing out. I think this history provides insight into how laws that were originally intended to protect a group can be used to punish that same group. As the trial of Mae West demonstrates, obscenity trials targeting those celebrity women who are considered sexual outlaws. The laws ostensibly designed to protect women were being used to punish the sexual outlaws of that group. These women were being used as examples, being targeted by police to demonstrate how dangerous it was to be transgressive socially or sexually as a woman. The body of Mae West was being forcibly confined, punished, and used as an example of what can happen if you dare to step out the bounds of normative sexuality. This deeper ambition of obscenity laws helps explain why laws intended to protect youth are being used to prosecute them. The concern of these laws is the protection of children from predators, but in the context of the masturbating child, it's possible that predators themselves and their own purported mischievous sexuality. I think ultimately the one sort of glimmer of hope that the Mae West example gives, though, is that discipline can't hold back the times of normative change if indocile bodies refuse to self-regulate. So, as we can see by Mae West, who said, "I think this is going to be the making of me," and just adamantly refused to give up her indocile position, then the discipline project doesn't work. But it's a lot easier. I struggle with this though because I think it's a lot easier for someone like Mae West, who had resources and was a white woman, and to resist these projects of docility than it would be, you know, a black heterosexual like couple down in North Carolina who have probably a lot fewer resources.
So I'm going to speak about a project which is sort of a patchwork précis of different arguments that I make in my dissertation about the use of consensual dispute resolution in the context of campus sexual violence. So by now it should be well known that campus sexual violence is a systemic problem in Canada. Sexual victimization rates of women are disturbingly high, while reporting rates of violence are worryingly low. In response to legislative efforts in Ontario, BC, and Manitoba, and elsewhere, and sustained political pressure from student activists across the country, nearly every college and university in Canada has now drafted and in most cases implemented a standalone campus sexual violence policy. However, the content of these policies varies widely from school to school. Universities have been granted a wide berth of discretion to design these policies in the way that they see fit. And few policymakers agree about the best way to repair the harm caused by sexual violence and to promote cultural change on campus. The debate is equally contentious in the United States, where critical attention to the issue has intensified in recent years, really since 2011, since President Obama announced, and President Trump has since rolled back, a bold and aggressive approach to Title IX enforcement. The resulting discussions inspired Emily Bazelon a few years ago to write a feature in the New York Times Magazine proclaiming the return of the sex wars had dawned at American colleges and universities. Incidentally, in that article, she featured two prominent feminist legal theorists, Catherine McKinnon and Janet Halley, who I was working with at the same time in that year, and it was an instructive experience about all these issues that I'm talking about today. So what Bazelon meant by the return of the sex wars is that contrasting views about how to address the problem of campus sexual violence invoked a decade-long debate among feminists about the roles of agency and coercion in determining the content of women's erotic lives. So I would argue that the return of the sex wars has spilled across the border. The ideological divide between feminists who work on campus peer sexual violence in Canada has become increasingly polarized and politicized. So while the issues of agency and coercion are central to many aspects of this debate, I'm going to focus my remarks today on competing feminist legal treatments of these issues as they relate to one aspect of legal process, and specifically the use of consensual dispute resolution as a means of addressing campus peer sexual violence. The main sticking point appears to be whether consensual processes should be offered by colleges and universities as an alternative to adjudication at the complainant's request, or whether the gendered power dynamics in these cases mean that consensual processes should be categorically unavailable or severely limited to complainants despite their request. So by definition, consensual dispute resolution is an interest-based process. I use the term consensual dispute resolution as opposed to alternative dispute resolution, or ADR, on purpose, because the definition of ADR, as many of us conceive it, includes domestic arbitration or international arbitration, which is an adversarial rights-based process in effect. So I'm trying to exclude that process from my discussion. I'm talking about processes such as mediation and restorative justice, which essentially allow two or more disputing parties to resolve their conflicting interests by voluntary agreement, potentially with the assistance of neutral third-party facilitators, legal counsel, or other members of the community who are personally affected by the events. Crucially, the parties' agreement is the product of mutual commitment and compromise, which is reached through a collaborative process rather than imposed by judicial or administrative decree. The basic rationale for consensual dispute resolution processes is that once freed from the abstract legal categories and cumbersome procedures that characterize the formal law, courts, and tribunals, an interest-based process can get to the heart of the underlying trouble from which disputes emerge by focusing on building accountability and trust between the parties, which is more likely to assist the parties to generate creative options and design the terms of their own recovery beyond what a court or tribunal might have the jurisdiction to order in the adjudication of rights claims. So since the height of the original sex wars from the late 70s to the early 90s, the trend toward the increasing privatization of civil and criminal justice has proven extremely controversial. Feminists have long argued that women who participate in forms of private ordering, such as negotiation, mediation, and restorative justice, may be vulnerable to power imbalances if the processes are administered in a manner that replicates systemic inequalities in the liberal market that disadvantage women. This may be especially problematic in cases where, as a legal or practical matter, the processes fall outside the reach of public scrutiny or challenge by the courts. So against this historical backdrop, the use of private ordering has become a crucial battleground in, again, what Emily Baswan and I call the return of the sex wars in Canada. Just as feminists had sparred and are sparring about the legal treatment of women's consent to sex, they are now sparring over the legal treatment of students' consent to settle complaints of campus sexual violence. So on the one side of the debate, there are feminists, anti-violence activists, and other critics, collectively whom I call the victims' rights advocates, who frame their political advocacy on the issue of gender equality, I would argue at least primarily in terms of minoritizing identity-based conceptions of women's injured subjectivity, translatable into rights claims, which require the protection of the state. So following McKinnon and other radical feminist forebearers, the victims' rights advocates rely on the formal legal system as a key element of their political strategy. In the campus peer sexual violence context, they've championed the use of academic discipline processes, civil courts, and criminal justice processes to publicly vindicate victims' rights that have been wrongfully infringed. For them, the most effective way to deter male violence and keep victims safe is to punish offenders for the harms they cause, whether in the form of expulsions from school, awards of monetary damages, temporary restraining orders, and criminal charges and convictions in appropriate cases. Correspondingly, they reject consensual dispute resolution because it is soft on crime and sacrifices public accountability in the name of private peace. Motivating this critique, many victims' rights advocates are concerned that consensual processes can lead to unfair procedures and unjust results that disadvantage women. This view is widely supported across Canada, causing many colleges and universities to severely limit the availability or in some cases categorically ban the use of consensual dispute resolution in their campus sexual violence policies. So to illustrate, the Ending Violence Association of British Columbia has argued in its recent guidelines that, quote, we strongly discourage the use of restorative justice processes, including mediation, in lieu of sanctions in cases of sexual violence. As sexual assault is a power-based crime, that is a crime where there is an imbalance of power or an abuse of power by the perpetrator and the victim survivor feels powerless to stop it and or come forward, end quote. So this language reflects the belief of many victims' rights advocates that male students will manipulate their power advantage over female students by pressuring them to agree on settlement terms that advance the men's interests alone. The clear subtext here, in my view, is radical feminism. From McKinnon, it follows that female students' claims to participate in so-called consensual dispute resolution can coexist with various inhibiting forms of non-physical force that can render the consent meaningless in practice and should invalidate their agreements as unconscionable to the public. As I understand it, the position of these advocates presumes that enforcing gender equality through the punitive apparatuses of the state will liberate women, and in particular victims, to live more freely and equally in society. However, I believe that this position may be failing to ask how certain rights-based discourses are limiting the range of conceptual tools that complainants have at their disposal to address the problem of campus peer sexual violence. So liberal legal theory teaches us that rights protect us from government intrusion in our lives. This is obviously correct in a sense, but I would argue that rights intrude in a different way. On a more basic level, rights are a form of public policy that regulate our relationships with one another. They are a form of social ordering that shape public perceptions about what society should value. As I see it, the position of many victims' rights advocates have defined the juridical subjects of campus peer sexual violence law and policy, male and female students, in at least three significant ways. First, complainants and respondents in these cases have been gendered in feminine and masculine terms, respectively, based on their alleged role in sex or settlement, and regardless of the individual's own professed identities, which may or may not correspond. According to radical feminist theory, male students commit acts of campus sexual violence and abuse power in consensual processes as men, while male and female victims experience acts of sexual violence and suffer abuses of power in consensual processes as women always. This means that the small percentage of victims who identify as male are effectively feminized by the prevailing feminist discourse, which considers campus sexual violence to be a harm of sexuality that determines the feminine gender of complainants in a position of sex inequality. Second, radical feminist theory invokes the rhetoric of women's innocence and injury, figuring complainants as presumptive victims in campus sexual violence policies as a means of women's identity formation and feminist political organization through the law reform process. This has arguably produced what Wendy Brown has theorized as wounded attachments to women's victimhood that need to be channeled and vindicated through the reciprocal punishment of male students in a rights-based process. Brown argues that these attachments may be psychologically disabling to women because they require female students to trade away their ability to choose consensual dispute resolution and more active participation in the justice process in exchange for the state's protection of their bodily safety. Third, complainants have been theorized as individual rights holders with particular capacities and incapacities to assert free agency. For instance, complainants would appear to have the capacity, not to mention the endurance, to participate in a formal dispute resolution process as prescribed by written policy, despite conditions of inequality that constrains women's choices and create barriers to access to justice. Yet at the same time, complainants would seem to lack the capacity to consent to sex or settlement in circumstances of power imbalance, even absent physical force, because of social conditions of inequality that constrain their choices and can render women's consent to hierarchic sex meaningless in a rape culture. So against this critical backdrop, I would encourage schools to break the constraints of radical feminist legalism on their political imaginary slightly for just a critical moment. And I would endorse the position of a diverse group of feminist legal process scholars, whom I call the victims' rights skeptics, who argue from the opposite side of the return of the sex wars, that consensual dispute resolution may have a crucial role to play in changing the conditions that produce women's sexual subjectivity in society. So the primary innovation of consensual dispute resolution is that it redefines the juridical subjects of sexual violence law from possessors of rights, which are abstract legal concepts, to possessors of rights and interests, which are their deeply felt wants and desires that may or may not be derived in their constructed identities as victims or perpetrators. This theory recognizes that while complainants may initially ask for legal relief through findings of liability or guilt, this relief will often be a proxy for the student's underlying interests that may or may not be easily translatable into rights claims or achieved by traditional remedies. And this is born out of the evidence of complainants' lived experiences. From the complainant's perspective, there's a potentially broad range of social, cultural, economic, and professional interests that cannot be fully satisfied by an award of academic discipline, monetary damages, or a criminal conviction. There may be reputational investments, there may be emotional reparations for harm done. A harsh penalty and a long sentence cannot guarantee that complainants will find closure, offenders will be rehabilitated, or that communities will change for the better. Preliminary research shows that by allowing complainants to retain decisional power in the justice process, consensual dispute resolution allows for a potentially wide range of legal and non-legal remedies that provide extensive opportunities for restorative benefit, educational impact, and therapeutic intervention. So to be clear, my argument is not that consensual dispute resolution can or should be used in every case of campus peer sexual violence. If complainants do not wish to participate at any time, the process cannot proceed by its own definition or by law. If the respondents refuse to accept responsibility or respect the account's wishes and proposals of complainants at any time, it may be impossible for the parties to have a constructive discussion and the process may need to be terminated. And if the respondents pose an ongoing threat of violence to complainants at any time, it may be impossible to approximate a balance of power between the parties that is required to maintain the integrity of the process and keep complainants safe. My argument, rather, is that critical approaches to campus peer sexual violence law and policy should be contextual to the lived experiences of complainants, which require us to appreciate how the law, and specifically how victims' rights talk, may be limiting the range of conceptual tools that complainants have at their disposal to address the problem of sexual violence. Our strategic reliance on radical feminist legalism has resulted in our turn to the public law and state-based dispute resolution processes at the expense of private law and interest-based models as a means of effecting social change. By doing so, we have overlooked more complex forms of regulatory action that may be necessary to redistribute power and welfare on campus. So looking forward, I suggest that we should try to empower women by promoting measures that improve their social, cultural, economic, and professional conditions. This strategy may incorporate elements of rights claiming and adjudicative processes, but it also entails, I think, meaningful and long-term engagement with forms of consensual dispute resolution in an effort to enhance women's ability to alter existing institutional arrangements and thereby change the culture that produces women's subjectivity in society. So I suggest that more research is needed to confirm how consensual processes are being implemented at schools where they are permitted, and how they can be made more widely available at other schools so that policymakers can revise and improve them as needed. This way we can better understand what role these processes should play in broader institutional and community efforts to promote safer, healthier, and more productive environments for students to study and to work. Thank you.
So I'm going to try to be quick, famous last words, and talk just a little bit about some of the things that I'm currently thinking about. Now, one of the dominant themes of my work for the last many years has been looking at the ways in which legal norms operate in relation to self-governance. And here I've drawn the later work of Foucault on governmentality and governance, governance of the conduct of self-conduct and technologies of the self. And what I've tried to look at through a range of different works is the ways in which legal norms, as diffused in and through cultural norms, become a basis for this technology of self-governance. And I've looked at it in terms of marriage, divorce, family, sexuality, motherhood, from self-governing around marriage and adultery, self-governing of the adult entertainment industry, self-governance of environmental risk by mothers. And one of the challenges I find in this work is how to make law's role visible in this, and how to somehow maintain one's position as a legal scholar by trying to find and tease out the relationship between these more diffuse cultural forms of self-regulation and the law, and by trying to see what the role of the law is here, particularly say in relation to sex law. How does sex law have a role in this self-governance of sexual subjects? I've looked at things, and I have a hunch around everything from the perceptions of regulatory failure to pervasive misunderstandings of legal rules to cultural norms advising subjects about how to avoid undesired legal outcomes. And I suppose I would just say that law's role here is one that is capacious, and yet one needs to find the particular ways in which it's having an impact here. Now, I'm currently thinking about these technologies of governance in relation to what Dan has just talked about as the return of the sex wars, what I'm referring to as the sex wars 2.0, where we're seeing, I think right now, very strongly the return of feminist sex wars from the 70s and the 80s on a broad range of issues of sex and sexuality, ranging from sex work, sexual representation, sexual harassment, sexual assault. I and others are seeing very similar debates playing out, although in ways that are quite different, particularly in relation to, say, sexual harassment and sexual assault. The previous sex wars were ones that feminists really stood antagonistically in relation to certain practices, sex work, pornography, whereas now it is not so much that there are feminists, say, in favor of sexual harassment or sexual assault, but rather a different understanding around how to understand the injury and how to understand the appropriate legal response, which is where the contestations, I think, are now. And we are, of course, right now in the midst of a moment of just a mind-boggling explosion of social and cultural norms around sex and sexuality. Me Too, Time's Up, allegations, backlashes, literally every day. In a way that I think is also now making it very, very different than the earlier sex wars. There's a mainstreamness to this that, of course, the earlier feminist sex wars have not had. And I think that's also partly related to the digital revolution. The technologies of social media here have made this, have given these debates and these issues an entirely different kind of viral reach. And I think that the rules, the practices, the norms, the biopolitics of the technologies of governance of bodies and populations, particularly in relation to consensual versus non-consensual sexuality, has just exploded. And any consensus, as has any consensus around appropriate sexual behaviors. And I think we really are living in this interesting, fascinating moment where many of the previous techniques of sexual governance around consensual heterosexual sexuality are floundering, collapsing, failing. And not that there was ever a clear consensus around this, there were always contestations, but right now we're seeing really the centrality of understandings failing. And what's the role of law in this? Well, what I also find really fascinating here is that much of Me Too has happened entirely outside of the legal terrain, or at least without resort to legal apparatuses. It's happening in the public sphere. So in the US, it started simply allegations in the public sphere, the digital public sphere, where sexual predators, sexual abusers are falling from grace in minutes, right? Literally in minutes. It started as, at first it took days, now it takes minutes. They're falling from grace, they're falling from employment, without the invocation of any legal mechanism. So is this a story of regulatory failure, of law not working, of the move to the public digital sphere, in part perhaps, but I don't think that that is telling the whole story of law's capacious role here in the technologies of sexual governance. So this week, and actually it's not even this week, it's sort of like yesterday or today because the terrain keeps changing, I'm particularly interested in the work that is now being done by the term sexual misconduct. So that has really emerged, I'd say, in the last couple of weeks as a term of contestation and as the allegation. The allegations now, in the last week or so, have been allegations of sexual misconduct. Now, in Canada, this is not a legal term, right? This is not something that is legally actionable. Sexual harassment is, sexual assault is, sexual exploitation is. These are found in the criminal code, they're found in human rights codes, they're found in a range of employment contexts and campus sexual violence policies, but sexual misconduct isn't. Now, sexual misconduct is in a number of states in the US. Sexual misconduct is actually a term that's used in a number of US jurisdictions instead of the term sexual assault. So in some US states, it's legally actionable. But even in the allegations being made in the US, it's not clear that it's being deployed in the manner consistent with the way in which it would be legally actionable, say, in Missouri. It's emerging as a term, I think, that captures sexual behavior that doesn't obviously meet the standards of, or the thresholds of sexual harassment and sexual assault. So, you know, in the last week, and as I say, the terrain, it's fascinating, it's just changing so quickly. Patrick Brown, Aziz Ansari. Those are just, you know, this last week's controversies. Both are accused of sexual misconduct. And accused here is really interesting, even because it doesn't have a legal meaning, right? There are no legal claims being brought here. This is all being done in the public sphere, which then in turn has the critics in a tizzy. So the critics are in a tizzy, also not exactly a legal term, but tizzy. Where's the procedural due fairness? Where's their day in court? You know, more than one critic, including Brown himself, has said that he will prove in court that these claims are baseless. And I'm like, how? Right? Like, where? Where are you going to court? How is this happening exactly? Now, he could bring a defamation case, I guess, but there seems to just be, there's this overlay of a legal understanding here, which is that these are complaints that must occur in legal forums, and they're not. They're not occurring in legal forms. None of this is occurring within law. As I say, unless Brown brings a defamation suit, that's not really something that's going to happen. And then what would he be defending against? He's defending against sexual misconduct. Well, what is that? There's an allegation of sexual misconduct. That is not a legal term. That is not a term of art. Is he going to dispute the events as articulated in the media didn't happen? Or that they happened, but they're okay? What is the defense here going to be? This is not intended. These are not things that are, as we have historically imagined, something that is legally actionable. And yet, the overlay here, particularly of the critics, is to move it immediately into a legal understanding and to criticize it in that way. And I think that this is providing, I think, a fascinating moment of understanding the way in which legal norms have up until very recently provided the terms and the frame of reference for self-governance. So, you know, sexual harassment, sexual assault, bad. You're not supposed to cross that line. But now, what is this sexual misconduct thing that isn't legal, but now you're not supposed to do that, and what is it? What is this thing? I think that what we're also seeing is a fascinating proliferation of horizontal discourses rather than the kind of, you know, vertical legal discourse. We are seeing an unprecedented proliferation of sexual discourses. The kinds of detailed descriptions from Ansari, the Babe article, Patrick Brown, we are seeing now incredibly detailed from the 19th century, lewd and lascivious descriptions of sexual interactions, the likes of which we really haven't seen, which is fascinating. So there's this articulation, and then there's a reaction to it, which is partially, that didn't happen, or partially, but so what? That happened, but that's just a normal night in heterosexual dating, comes from one side. So there's this incredible explosion of the discourses, and then a lack of any consensus around what those things that are being described mean. So I think we're really living in this absolutely fascinating moment about law's role in self-regulation, where there are the old consensus, and I'm not suggesting that the old consensus worked, but the old consensus about what lines you couldn't cross have changed. Law is no longer providing the dividing line between what is legitimate and illegitimate, and the contestations are now around what appropriate self-governance would be in a heterosexual dating context have moved well outside of those legal frames, although law is being called upon in ways that are still, I don't think any of us really understand, to do something about this, because that's what we always do. We go to law, and we can't really do that right now. All right, I will stop now, and then we're going to turn to some reactions to and responses to the papers of trying to tease out some of the similarities between the various papers.
This is really just designed to sort of open up discussion for the room. So some thoughts that I had in relation to Dan and Megan's papers. So there are obviously a number of ways in which these two research projects and papers connect. And I think the most obvious one, I think, perhaps is the age nexus between the two issues that they're discussing. So on the one hand, we have sexting, which raises questions of child pornography, which necessarily deals with children and adolescents. Campus sexual assault, on the other hand, is largely, but by no means exclusively, dealing with post-adolescence. So there's a fairly close age nexus here. And I think one of the broader legal and policy questions that this raises is there room for some sort of cohesive legal and social approach to this issue? What might an approach to sexual expression look like that takes account of this age nexus? I'm actually not going to pursue this as a question, it's more just to open this up for conversation for the room. What I want to focus on more particularly is this question that I think is raised again by both of the papers, which is the stakes of legal intervention and what are the perhaps unintended consequences of legal intervention in certain respects. So Megan's work paints, to me, a really stark image of the way that 19th century obscenity laws in the US, laws that were intended to protect from exploitation, ended up being used to punish sexually rebellious women themselves, in Megan's words. The Comstock Act and other laws, which were designed to protect young women from being victimised by predators looking to sexually exploit them, were flipped on their head and used to punish women for sexually exploiting themselves and exposing other women to debauched practices. Thus, the trial at Mae West, in Megan's reading, amounted to a disciplinary action on an indocile body. Protection had shifted into shaming. So as Megan points out in what I think is a powerful, historically based warning, this shift away from obscenity law's original purpose has a modern equivalent in the use of child pornography laws to target minors who are in possession of nude pictures of themselves and other minors. The North Carolina Child Pornography Protection Act was passed in the wake of social panic over alleged abuse in daycare centres and the peculiar 80s fashionability of repressed childhood trauma. Nevertheless, the law was intended to combat exploitation of minors by adults. As the Fayetteville Romeo and Juliet case shows, though, it's now being used to target minors who are interacting with other minors in a manner that is possibly, but by no means intrinsically exploitative. Experimentation, in this sense possibly misguided, possibly not, is being pummeled with the blunt edge of the criminal law in a manner that on rational analysis departs from the original intention of those laws. The result, which may be entirely desirable from the perspective of people bringing the charges against people like the Fayetteville Romeo and Juliet, is to send a message that teenage sexuality is shameful and risky. This is precisely the type of risk that I think Dan is concerned about in closing off consensual mediation in campus sexual assault cases. It's not only that a mode of dispute resolution which may be of benefit to complainants is being foreclosed, it's that removing this option from the table in an a priori manner figures complainants as presumptive victims with wounded attachments to victimhood. Hence the reservations expressed by those Dan calls victims' rights skeptics. I think the broader point here is one that animates much of the disagreement over the Me Too movement. What might the risks be in adopting too strident a tone, too unwavering a line in matters where, sometimes at least, tones are shaded and lines are wavy? In casting campus sexual assault complainants as presumptively female victims who are unable to withstand the pressures of mediation and, I might add, potentially dispensing with the due process interests of accused persons, do we risk the unintended consequence of undoing some of what feminism has fought so hard to achieve? A woman's right and ability to express herself as a sexual being without being labelled indocile or worse. Thanks.
Thanks. All right, so Professor Cossman really never fails to stretch and contort our brains, because she's basically asked me to speak about the connection between Dan's research, Luke's research, and how this similarity relates to the technologies of sexual injustice. So it's not the easiest question.
That's just a Saturday.
It's just a Saturday morning. So I'll keep it really short, but there's just a couple points that struck me between the papers. One is the role that moral panics play in the introduction and enforcement of laws controlling sexuality. I think both cases are really different, but really similar in that there's this undercurrent of this new colonial force in Wales, or now we're in the Trump era, where Gail Rubin says when there's possibility of complete annihilation, people are likely to get dangerously crazy about sexuality. So when we see periods of time when there's a lot of social anxiety going on around other larger demographic changes, we can see it playing out in these sex wars. So I thought that was interesting. The other point I wanted to make was just, I think it's just class, and how this whole debate on campuses is so much about just upper class white women. And now the debate is can we consent to dispute resolution about our sexual assault, but women like Alora Wells are still dying without even getting any sort of attention. So I think that there's still a lot of work to be done in the movement around class, and I think that this whole debate around campus sexual assault is pretty inherently classist. And the last point that I found really interesting about your guys' work together is the role that of community policing, and the way that laws, criminal laws or administrative laws, get used by members of the community to regulate other members of the community's sexuality. I think that it was the vigilante police in the community that were arresting on sodomy charges. And in your case, it's really the radical feminists who are trying to regulate how women feel about their sexual assaults. So those are just a couple of points.
That was great. I'm going to try to keep this really brief. There were a lot of ways that Megan and Luke's presentations relate to one another, but I'll just focus, I think, on one aspect of how both of you rely heavily on Foucault to explain the complex juridical and biopolitical power dynamics at work in the legal regulation of buggery in New South Wales and obscenity in Fayetteville, respectively. And I think this suggests a provocative new area of inquiry in our broader discussion about the role of law as a tool of sexual governance. Paradoxically, despite what I think you both explicitly argued, I think that we can conclude from both of your talks that the discursive impacts of buggery laws in New South Wales and obscenity laws in Fayetteville may have helped to shape at least some members of the public in both of those constituencies into indocile bodies, into the kind of sexual outlaws that Brenda described that these laws were designed to protect against. Because as I understand it, the buggery laws and the obscenity laws that both of you describe operated in the same manner that, as Luke said, quoting Foucault, as an apparatus for producing an ever greater quantity of discourse about sex that operated along the horizontal field of force relations, the biopolitical plane. Luke, you argued in New South Wales that buggery laws became an incitement to speak about the truth of buggery's existence and the manner of its commission, to the extent that these laws encourage witnesses to stand and watch the action before intervening. And similarly, Megan, you argued that in Fayetteville, obscenity laws became what we might also call an incitement to speak about child pornography, through which what you described, again quoting Foucault, as the power of writing, the flurry of media attention that surrounded the lives of these masturbating teenagers. I think as a general matter, when laws are deployed vertically to regulate non-normative sexual acts, whether buggery in New South Wales or obscenity in Fayetteville, it seems inevitable that these laws will operate simultaneously on the horizontal plane to proliferate these cultural discourses about sex. And by doing so, these impacts help to shape our sexual subjectivity into being through an ongoing process of resignification. So, this in one way operates, as you said, Megan, to discipline Mae West and others into docile bodies, but paradoxically, I think that this also helped to discipline at least some members of the viewing public who watched the action or who consume these media discourses into indocile bodies by inciting them to engage with the pleasures of non-normative sexuality. So Umni Khan has made this point about legal representations of sadomasochism. She argued that when members of the public consume discourses about S&M, they may be vicariously participating in the practice of S&M and attending to its erotic pleasures of objection, disgust, and expulsion, while simultaneously distancing themselves from the actual practice of S&M by seeking to excise it from the social fabric. So I think in this way, your work raises a really interesting question about the role of law as a tool of sexual governance. As we've increasingly turned to the law and to the state as a means of regulating non-normative sexuality, have we unwittingly, or perhaps wittingly, proliferated the erotic pleasures that can attend to those acts?
And I guess I would just say, when I look at these three presentations, what I see is three richly textured case studies that really seek to tease out in very contextual ways the techniques of sexual governance. And rather than in any kind of grand theorizing, through these case studies are trying to do the work of the retrieval of law in biopolitics. What is the role of law here? Looking at law not simply in its juridical, vertical field of force, but also in its horizontal one. And so what I see here are the ways in which legal regulation contributes to this proliferation of discourses about sex and sexuality. And of course, if you're a hammer, everything is a nail. What I see is the role of law in self-governance throughout each of the papers. And in this way where their works are phenomenally different, yet each really contributing to what I think is this crucial project of seeking to retrieve the role of law in biopolitics.